家好，我係今日講座嘅司儀 Natalie， 歡迎大家出席由香港科學館、香港中文大學新亞書院同生命科學學院聯合主辦嘅任國榮先生生命科學講座。今次講座，我哋有幸邀請到德國康斯坦茲大學水生系統適應遺傳學教授、國際珊瑚學會主席 Professor Christian R. Voolstra 為大家主講，題目係珊瑚礁與氣候變遷，緩解生態崩潰。我哋亦邀請到香港中文大學李福善海洋科學研究中心主任羅海偉教授主持講座。除咗喺香港太空館嘅現場講座會同時於 Zoom、香港科學館 Facebook 專頁同 YouTube 頻道現場直播。講座完結後設有問答環節，如果大家有任何問題，歡迎屆時舉手發問。收睇網上直播嘅觀眾亦可留言發問，我哋會因應時間代為向 Professor Voolstra 發問。喺正式開始之前，我哋先邀請香港中文大學理學院及生命科學學院院長陳浩然教授為我哋簡介任國榮先生生命科學講座。有請陳教授。
So, Professor Voolstra, Professor Hector Chen, head of New Asia College, and all the college members of New Asia College, and also my colleagues and friends and students from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm so glad to be here today in my capacity as a director of the School of Life Sciences, Chinese University of Hong Kong, to introduce you the lecture. So as you can see here, this is the Renguorong lecture in life sciences, and this is also the 10th lecture since we started this lecture series. So I'm so grateful to here to explain to you about the history of this lecture series, which was started in 2015 with the generous support and donation of a New Asia College from a family of Dr.任國榮, founding chairman of the Department of Biology of the college. And each year, we have invited different distinguished scholars, biologists, and more recently, we all call ourselves life scientists to share with us their views on certain aspects of life sciences. And the lecture series actually have broadened the knowledge of life sciences among staff, students, and as of today, the general public. And today is the third and also the final lecture of Professor Voolstra. And Professor Voolstra actually already given a lecture at the New Asia College Assembly, a research seminar at the School of Life Sciences, and today he will be sharing with us a topic on coral reefs and climate change, mitigating the ecological collapse. So I have attended the previous two lectures. I'm very, very looking forward to Professor Voolstra's today's lecture, which would actually bring scientific investigation, life sciences knowledge, and the conservation concept together. And I hope you all enjoy the lecture. And I also encourage you all to participate in the question and answer sections, and we will have a very enriched discussion and interaction. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Haiwei Luo. It's from Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I do marine microbiology and coral microbiology stuff. So today it's my great honor to have our distinguished professor, Professor Voolstra, Chris Voolstra, to visit CUHK and to deliver one of the talks that is facing to the general public. So let me briefly introduce Professor Voolstra's biography. So he received undergraduate degree and PhD degree from University of Cologne, Germany. So then he started actually his own career at KAUST. KAUST is King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi, which is very famous for coral research. Then Professor Voolstra further advanced to full professor and accepted a very distinguished position at University of Constance, Germany. So he is dedicated in genetics of adaptation in aquatic systems. So Professor Voolstra holds many distinguished positions. Among these, I'm not going to through this whole very long list, okay? But I would just say he is current our society chair, president. That is the society. Our society is the International Coral Reef Society. Okay, so he's currently is the president. So he is super productive academically. He's currently already published over 300 peer-reviewed publications and got almost 30,000 citations. For people who know science, so we all care about H index. So he got H index more than 90. So this is very rare for marine ecology scientists. Okay, so among these, so he published many top tier journals. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Voolstra to your stage.
I'm gonna try to do this while I stand. Otherwise, you won't see me, and I also need to move around. It's easier for me. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really had a great time so far in Hong Kong. And Highway, one reason why I have so many papers is because of colleagues like you and collaborations. This is really the essence of research, like working together on problems. I also want to point out that the first speaker is actually here from the lecture series. So sorry, I forgot your name, but it's a great honor to have you here and to actually make the effort for you to come. So of course, pressure is on me now to make it worth your time and all of your time. I'm gonna talk about coral reefs. Can I quickly ask who's actually a student? Okay, students, just, okay, good. You will see in a second why. But we can already jump right into the topic. So what you see in the background, that's actually a little boat, which we call a dinghy. And these dark things underwater, this is actually coral, right? So it's a huge organism. It's actually the biggest biogenic structure we have on this planet. But very briefly, and this is pretty much why I asked who's a student, if I would sum up my career in one sentence, it was completely not planned, okay? I started with fruit flies, I changed to mice, was still not super happy, then I went for a postdoc to Mexico to do field work, and then I traveled to Saudi Arabia. As you can imagine, my parents were pretty excited. But this kind of all the time I followed my heart, and I think I found what I really like and what I'm good at. And if you're a student, I also encourage you to do this. Like, it's not a problem to transcend different things. Throughout my career, I did very different things, but every time I went from one place to another, I brought something to this place which people didn't have, and I learned something from people there which I don't have. So it always looked like a bug, but it's actually a feature. So it helped me a lot in my career doing this. Okay, and of course the irony is now I live at one of the biggest lakes in Europe doing marine biology. So yeah, you do the math. Okay, but let's jump right in. So I already said it, coral reefs are the largest biogenic structures on Earth. So what we look at here is actually a picture taken from the moon by NASA. This is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's the biggest coral reef system in the world. But I mean, there's hardly any other biological thing that you can take a picture from the moon and you can still recognize it, right? If you zoom in a little bit closer, this is actually what you see. And Charles Darwin, the founder of the theory of evolution, he was actually also really interested in coral reefs. And he called it the oasis in the desert of the ocean. Which is for two reasons. A, because coral reefs are actually incredibly rare if you consider the entire size of the ocean, so only 0.1 to 0.2% of the ocean surface are coral reefs. And B, because you can see this very nicely here. You have this crystal clear blue water in the background, and only where you have corals, you have all the life. So coral literally are the oasis for all the life in these ecosystems. And then if you further zoom in, which is also, I think, a very nice picture to illustrate, right? Like anybody can easily recognize 20 different species here. And coral reefs are actually the rainforests, or termed the rainforests of the ocean. So 25% of all described marine species are tied to the presence of coral reefs at one point in their life. And they provide goods and services for people. So you're probably more aware of here because you have the ocean all around you. And of course, fish is a very important source of protein. Then this is a picture from Egypt, tourism. This is actually a benign picture. I've been there 10 years ago. Every day in the year, there's 100 boats of this size going to a small coral reef, and they deploy 1,000 divers. And these corals are still there. So we have to acknowledge that corals are sensitive to environmental change, but on another note, they are also very resilient, right? If you think about that, 1,000 people come to your house each day and have a look around, and you could see how your house looks like after a year, right? And then coral reefs also provide shoreline protection, which you can see here in the lower right. This is actually a huge barrier, and people calculated the wave energy that coral reefs absorb, and it equals basically the energy of a nuclear bomb in many places. So there is a lot of energy from the ocean that the coral reef takes away, and therefore they make the shoreline more stable. So these are all good things, but and this is all pictures I took from my various trips. So of course there's local problems, right? Like we produce a lot of garbage, or we have produced a lot of garbage. I have to say I rarely came across plastic waste here, which is very good that you have such a good effort in Hong Kong of avoiding this. But this is how the shore in front of a coral reef looks like in one of my expeditions in the Coral Triangle. Then, of course, the major big cities of this planet historically have been either built at large near rivers or the ocean, because it's very easy to get rid of your waste, right? And the last local threat, so below this is, I have to look at Palm Jumeirah. So this is an artificial city in Dubai, which it's a bit of a sensitive issue, but there were coral reefs there, and it's not exactly clear whether they used coral reefs as a foundation for this, but it just highlights this bigger issue that everybody wants to build close to the ocean for various reasons, and of course this affects the life in the ocean. You also have a lot of shoreline construction here, right? And it's important to figure out that we do this sustainable and in harmony with nature. But besides these local threats, there is one global threat, which is climate change. And I was also very pleasantly surprised that this is very much acknowledged here, right? I heard that people that live longer in Hong Kong, they actually experience the change, that you have more hurricanes or tropical storms, so they are more often and they are more severe. And I think this is a very good graphic, because it just conveys the numbers that we are looking at. So what is basically plotted here is the atmospheric CO2 concentration in blue against the man-made carbon emissions in gray, right? There's almost a one-to-one correspondence. So I think you don't have to be a scientist or a researcher to see that there's a very high likelihood that one basically makes consequence of the other. And then plotted over this is the temperature anomaly. This is pretty much a global threat for corals, and I'm telling you in this slide why. So we all have probably heard climate change or ocean warming, but a little acknowledged fact is that 93% of this extra heat energy actually go into the ocean, okay? So the ocean is the biggest buffer of warming that we have, and without our oceans, it would probably already be very unbearable to live here on this planet for humans. So closer to my home turf or my scientific expertise, what this ocean warming does, it triggers so-called coral bleaching. So what you see here in the middle is a coral colony, which is this spooky white. Okay, so bleaching describes this physical process of whitening. It's important to acknowledge that these corals are not dead. Okay, they are basically negatively affected, and what actually happens in bleaching is depicted here. So a lot of times people describe corals as colorful rocks. Okay, they are not rocks. They are also no plants. They are animals. They are sessile animals, so they attach to a place and then they grow from there. But they do one specific thing that only a couple of animals do. They actually associate with tiny plant cells, which we call algae, and these tiny plant cells live in their tissue, and you all know that plants do photosynthesis, right? So these algae do nothing else. They do photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is basically converting sunlight energy into biological energy. So in the process of doing that, they create sugars and other nutrients, and these they give to the coral, and this is basically how the coral lives. Okay, so it's an animal that learned to live like a plant. And if we look at the tiniest unit of coral colonies, it's this here. So it's a so-called polyp, but if you turn it upside down, you have a jellyfish. And you all know jellyfish, or most of you, because it's a delicacy here, I learned, okay? So I haven't tried coral polyps yet, but I had them in my mouth while I was diving. And what you can see here, the golden dots, this is basically these algal cells that live inside these polyp tissues. Okay, so what happens is that if the water warms, corals start to bleach. So why is that so, we might actually ask? And I showed you very initially that coral reefs are incredibly rare. And the reason why they are rare is because there's only few places where you can actually grow as a coral, right? You have to be at a shoreline, you have to be at the right depths, you have to have the right light, because you have to house these tiny algal cells to do photosynthesis. So corals compete with each other for this benthic space to grow, and what that leads to in evolutionary terms is that they become each other becomes competitive, so they maximize growth at the summer temperatures. And of course, if you maximize something and you give everything, you become very sensitive to any increase in temperature, which is what we see here. So small long-term increases of temperature actually trigger this process of coral bleaching. Okay, only 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above these summer means. So somehow corals ended up in this evolutionary road that they are become inadvertent victims of climate change. Because of their biology, they had to maximize basically their growth at a temperature, or their optimum at a temperature that is very close to the summer temperature, and because we now have this slight increase, this is actually detrimental to them. So we saw that single corals bleach, right? But then how does it actually look like? Do you have bleaching everywhere? And I was privileged enough to go on this Tara Pacific expedition. So this is the boat. It's 30 meters long, and it was built to swim in the Arctic. So what does that mean? It's made completely out of aluminum, and it floats on the ice, okay? Which is the most horrible thing you can have if you're on the ocean, because it's literally a nutshell where every wave movement goes with the boat. So I was excited to go on the boat, and then I got sick for 5 days. It was really not pleasurable. But I was on a part of the expedition that brings us to the middle of nowhere. Okay, Ducie Island is actually very close where the mutiny of the Bounty happened, if you guys are familiar with this book. It's like 2 days away. But so we sailed for 6 weeks, blue on the floor, blue in the sky, and then this tiny island appears here, Ducie Island. So this is as far as you can get away from any direct human impact, and this was my first dive. This is actually me in the water. So you can see crystal clear water, right? But then everything is bleached. So this was very shocking and kind of a reminder that it's very hard for corals to escape this, and that it's a global phenomenon, coral bleaching. This is then the more, if we look at the numbers of it, this is actually from the World Wildlife Fund report. So this is very important to acknowledge because, of course, in terms of geological times, humans don't become very old, right? So we are kind of guided by the experience in our lifetime, but things change so quickly now in the environment that even within everybody's lifetime, you can already feel the difference. Like in my case, I remember that we had snow in the winter in Germany. We still have snow every now and then, but not like what we had as kids. And it's the same for corals and coral bleaching. So corals bleached before, like there were isolated episodes, but this first global coral bleaching, this first mass coral bleaching actually appeared in the 80s. And then we were 20 years away from the first global mass bleaching. And then you can see what I told you about the tropical storms in Hong Kong, right? So with time moving forward, the events become more frequent and they become more extreme. So the third event, which essentially ran from 2014 to 17, for the data that we had, 80% of the coral bleached and 35% died. So this is the equivalent to, if you would say that in the course of 3 years, you lose 35% of the ocean, of the tropical rainforest, if this would happen on land. So this is pretty much as drastic as it gets. And ironically, we just published the paper on the data analysis from this third event while this fourth event actually unfolded. So this is also almost 2 years ago and still ongoing. All these red, yellow, and purplish colors, this is pretty much our ocean. The blue thing is where there is no stress. There's pretty much only one area left where there was no stress, right? But the warming is now so extreme that these people that analyze these data, they have to come up with new scales. So, and this is very dramatic, right? And this is what I'm talking about within lifetime. So you can see that here we have 3 alert levels. 5 years later, we have 5 alert levels. So it becomes so extreme that you have to basically extend the scale of what is happening. And somehow we have to remind ourselves that this is not normal. Okay, and then of course it's me, a scientist, and scientists usually think their topic is super important and I have to warn everybody. But what I'm telling you here is basically, how do you say, well, literally the accepted consensus opinion from governments and stakeholders and politicians worldwide. So the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change, okay, this has all these people, scientists, politicians, governance, stakeholders, lobbyists, and so on. They release a consensus document, so this usually has the most benign language, right? Everybody needs to agree what is in there. And in this special document of how does our world look like at 1.5 to 2 degree warming, they literally say that we have a very high risk of losing 70 to 99% of corals. Okay, so this is not an over-dramatization by scientists. This is the consensus opinion globally. So we have to do something about it. basically. And well, yeah, so I don't know how you feel about it, but I run into a lot of students or people generally that find all of this overwhelming, right? Because like working with this, you still have to find your happy place in life. I mean, being depressed all the time doesn't help anyone. But so one thing that helped me in answering this question for me was a meeting in 2018. So this was 2 months after this IPCC report was released. And yeah, you can see me. I'm still young and fresh 6 years ago or 8 years ago. And Prince Albert from Monaco. So he's actually an ocean activist, okay? He's an avid diver. He does a lot for the environment in Europe. This is very well known. And he invited basically influential coral reef biologists to answer this question. Okay, everybody is talking about the reef crisis, but what does it actually take to save reefs? And one thing we did in this exercise is we did a modeling of how high frequency bleaching looks like moving forward under 4 different scenarios. And these 4 different scenarios is basically keep carbon emissions as it is, or lower carbon emissions with 2 other options, adaptations and no adaptations. And these adaptations is a broad term, so it can be societal, socio-economic, and scientific implementations or solutions. And there's various important things which I took home from this. So the most important thing, of course, is that, well, there's only one way out of it, is the most important message, right? You can see that these 3 trajectories, they basically these 3 trajectories, you all end up in the 100% bleaching. So this is where we don't want to be. You want to be down there in the lower right. There's only one trajectory, low emission with adaptation. But what this means is that this carbon emission thing is basically the non-negotiable part. Okay, and I'm saying this because now I run in conferences where they tell me, well, you have engineering solutions, so we can go ahead with carbon emissions. No, we can't not. This is the prerequisite. Somehow we need to find a way to curb this, okay? But the other important part, and this is where I get my hope, it's essential and necessary, but it's not sufficient in its own right to actually make the change, okay? You still need this adaptation element, and this is pretty much what I talk about, how we mitigate this ecological collapse. So I'm not the person, or my job as a coral reef biologist is not how we can curb CO2 emissions, but I can help with this adaptive part to make sure that both things meet. The other important message is, of course, that if we follow this model, and if the model is correct, this needs to be fixed in our lifetime, right? So it's a responsibility, but it's also a motivation, I think. So we have to do this now. And I looked up this number for you. So what we do is completely insufficient. So who knows what the Apollo mission is? Putting a man on the moon, right? This was the big space battle between the US and Russia back in the days. So back in the days, they invested $25.8 billion, which is nowadays the equivalent, so tenfold, $257 billion, to put a man on the moon, just to achieve this one thing. This is the current spending, and this is under President Barack Obama. So I don't know what this number looks like now, but even under a president of the US that acknowledged the problem, it was 16.5 billion, so 6% of what it was worth to us to put a man on the moon, okay? So there is money to do this, we just not invested into this cause. Okay, sorry about that. But so I already told you this, right? The adaptations is a broad term that incorporates biological, ecological, and socio-economic interventions. And I create out the CO2 mitigations for a reason I already told you. This we need to take care of, but this is not what I'm talking about. If we talk about adaptations in basically, and what I can do as a coral reef biologist, there's pretty much two things at my disposal. It's conservation, which you're all aware, or which you're all familiar with. It's conserving native habitat. But in many places, or in a lot of places, this might actually not be enough. And then there's active intervention, which is a newly coined term, which I actually like, because restoration is already a problem. If you restore to previous state, we already know that it doesn't work, because we see how it works in nature, right? Restoring to previous state or situation is not good enough. So we kind of need to rebuild it. But the broader term is active intervention. So I talk a little bit about both. And so I dove in this reef. This is in Australia, in the Great Barrier Reef. You have to go very far out. But Australia is very special because it's a small country. It's an industrial country. They don't rely on coral reef ecosystem services. They don't need to fish, and so on. So they can actually afford, quote unquote, to leave reefs alone. But this is a normalization how many fish you would see in a reef, okay? And I encourage everybody, so there is a diary of James Cook. Who knows who James Cook is? He's the one that, quote unquote, discovered Australia. So he arrived in Australia, and he has a diary where he describes when they see the first coral reefs. So apparently it was shark-infested waters, and they were jumping around like dolphins. So the coral reefs back in the days must have been completely crazy. I think we cannot possibly imagine, but this is what I remember when I look at this picture, right? So again, this normalization, if I go diving nowadays, I'm very excited to see a few sharks, but there was a situation back in the days where ecosystems like coral reefs could support immense amounts of organismal diversity. Okay, but back to the topic. So if you have to save, I just told you there are so many species in coral reefs. How do you actually start? But this is the proxy. Saves the corals, saves the reefs. Okay, so corals are literally the prerequisite for everything else. If you make sure that the corals are there, the rest will follow, which is important to tell people, because I work in Indonesia a lot, and they care about corals to the extent that this is where they fish, okay? But you have to tell them that if you save the corals, you save the fish, and they have more fish, but you need to make these connections. Over lunch, I just had a discussion about how human health is connected to ecosystem health, right? And this is one example. And one thing we want to focus on is so-called bright spots, which is also a pitch to ocean optimism, right? I now say this, and maybe I take away a question from somebody, but if you think about it, I would always prefer to live in the future than in the past, because I think we have the technology and we can do something about it, and this bright spots goes into this ocean optimism thing. There is reefs that do much better than expected, and I think those are worthwhile to basically understand what are they doing different from the rest of this world or the rest of the reefs. And Dan Barshes, who was my partner in crime back in the days, we actually had the same idea about 10 years ago. So you then start to look at the data and the published literature, and it turns out we actually don't have such a good idea where these bright spots or these super reefs exist. And of course, it's nice to go diving, but it's also, generally, it's hard to access a coral reef, okay? A, you need to be in the place. B, you need to have diving gear, and then you need to go underwater, and then you need to measure the corals underwater. So you're always 1 degree from convenience, okay? So doing experiments underwater is very complicated. So when we started thinking about this, we wanted to have some standardized coral climate test that we can quickly deploy to measure corals. And then if you do this, you can basically identify corals that are very tolerant, stress tolerant or resilient. And then you can compare to places where they are less stress tolerant and resilient. And it's also important that it was not meant, well, it's like a COVID test, okay? Well, every one of you is familiar with that. You do COVID tests. If the thing lines up, you know that you have to pay attention and that you are in all likelihood to have COVID and so on. And this is a similar idea. It's not that this is the be-all, end-all answer to why these corals are tolerant, but it's a way to basically see if you identify the coral of interest. So this is how this looks like. It's basically 2 boxes with 4 tanks. This 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have these little coral fragments in all of it. You can actually pack it in 2 or 3 suitcases, and you can also deploy it in hotel rooms and in Airbnb. So this is in a very fancy resort in Abu Dhabi. Don't tell the people, they are not happy about this. If they hear it, and you know how it is, if you tell people that you're doing experiments in their hotel room, it doesn't go so well. This is an Airbnb where we did it, but this was a formerly living room. We actually have time capture videos of how we transform the living rooms into the laboratory. But you can do it, that's the whole point. Right now you can actually bring your lab to the reefs, which is much easier than bringing the corals to the lab, unless you live right in front of the corals. So this is now the sciencey part. What we basically do is it's like we put the corals on a hamster wheel and we measure how fast they can run in a very quick succession. And as I said, this is a proxy of which corals do well. Let's see if this video works here. Yes. This is actually how we collect them. So this is an underwater drill. You can see it's very quick. And then you get these little pieces out, and these little pieces is what ultimately ends up in the test. So this is actually not very intrusive for coral. If you do this, you can basically put a little paste over it and the coral fully recovers from it. So funnily enough, there are certain places where we went to sample over and again, and we literally we found our little paste that we put over the coral. So we drilled in the same site. It was completely indistinguishable. But what you can see, so these 2 pictures, this is actually 10 pieces from 10 colonies at a control temperature and at a very high temperature. And you can clearly see that the top left one is very white and the top right one stayed dark. So according to our test, that would then be, the right one would be a tolerant coral and the left one would be susceptible coral. Okay, this is, don't know. So if you have 4 temperatures, you can do something that is called a dose response curve. It's actually borrowed from the medical literature. You can see the response with an increase in stress, and you can clearly see that the coral, the red line, is the dose response curve of a population that is tolerant, and they can hold out much longer. If you look at, it takes a lot of temperature for them to lose the performance in comparison to the blue population. But now we basically have a scheme of how we can differentiate this. This is the point to make. And what we found, in essence, as I said, back in the days, I was in the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a very narrow, very deep, and very warm sea. And but it's also a very there's also a very strong gradient, which you actually have here in Hong Kong waters too. So gradients are always cool for science because you basically have the same geography and site, but you have different environmental conditions, right? If I compare corals from the Red Sea and the Great Barrier Reef, arguably it's 2 very different sites, 2 very different evolutionary histories. But if you stay in the same site, you can actually attribute the difference to the environment. So turns out that these northern Red Sea corals are super temperature tolerant, which you can see here. And the reason for this is actually in the Bible. So you're not too familiar with the Bible, me neither. But you probably remember that at one point the people of Israel went through the Red Sea. So the Red Sea dried out. This is a historical fact, okay? And the corals that had to repopulate the Red Sea, they all came through this small opening. So they all had to go through this very warm environment here in the southern Red Sea. So even the corals that ended up in the very north, they were selected through this And this is what basically explains this phenomenon that we measured, right? So we have corals in a much colder water, but because they had to migrate through this very warm zone, they basically kept their evolutionary advantage, so to say. And this is actually nice because if you count the days we were in the water, it was 2 weeks, so very quick. So what comes from this is basically this idea, okay, so now you have a test system to identify this naturally resilient coral, and A, you can do this to inform conservation, so where do you find them? And B, you can do this to inform active intervention approaches. So how are resilient corals different to stressed corals? And this is what we did. Basically, so Paul Allen is a philanthropy. He's actually the co-founder of Microsoft. So we got money to deploy this system globally and measure corals, which is very nice. And what we are currently, here you can see that there's actually a lot of people that do this, which is great, right? Like if a lot of people do the same thing, you have a lot of data to compare with. But what we're building right now, are you using Google Maps here, or is there another app to navigate? Okay, yes. So we are building Google Maps for coral conservation. So all these experiments that we have, we upload to a database, and then you can either select your species of interest or your region. You can identify who did experiments there, on what species, and B, so you have this convenient slider. So in the day of smartphone, each of you could now do a scientific study. Where do you find the most thermally tolerant coral? And then you could basically match this with satellite data, and you could check what are the environmental conditions that led to this. So this is an ongoing effort. This is basically the beta release, but you can play around with it. It works already. I think we have 250 experiments already uploaded, but there's much more to come, which I think is an exciting initiative. And yeah, so having talked about this conservation, this other aspect, active intervention, right? I already explained it. So who has heard the term microbiome before? Gut microbiome, so, okay. So bacteria are actually good. News, okay? Bacteria are not always bad. So each of us, we have a lot of bacteria. I think we are actually outnumbered 1 to 10 by bacterial cells. Yeah, we have 10 more bacterial cells on us and in us than human cells, okay? And whatever we eat, we couldn't use if it weren't for the bacteria. But somehow it took a very long time for the scientific literature or scientific approach to consider that, well, there might be a reason why we have so damn many bacteria. So the sum of all bacteria is called the microbiome. Okay, biome is usually the entity of something in the biological world, and the microbiology biome is the microbiome. So as I said, the human microbiome is probably what you are most familiar with. So these studies are, it's not just, it's not just tuning your car, okay? There is, your mood depends on the bacteria you have in your gut, which in turn, the bacteria you have in your gut depends on what you eat. So this, you are what you eat, has now a scientific correlate for real, okay? So this goes actually very deep. So accordingly, what I told you before, the coral animal and the algae, now we have a third player, which is the bacteria. And back in the days, we did an experiment. I have to see how I invest time. Back in the days, we did an experiment. So like even in the science world, not everything is ideal, okay? Like if I learned one thing, then that humans are creatures of habit, and it's very hard to break habits, okay? So in the science world, you learn something when you're a student, and then you believe that this is true for the rest of your life, but we have to constantly update each other, and we have to read more papers and do more studies to basically stay up to date. So classically, these algae are associated with temperature tolerance in coral, but in this experiment, we basically showed that also the coral bacteria are important. So conveniently, you can how to say this in a nice way, you can chunk coral colonies into various pieces, and because they are colonial, each piece of this coral colony is a real representative of the colony. So you have the same genotype in different experiments with the same life history, which is very powerful for experimental design. So what we basically showed in this study that we could transfer microbiomes from heat tolerant to heat susceptible corals, and then these corals actually behaved identical to the heat tolerant corals. So irrespective of host genotype or host DNA, which all stayed the same, so you literally transformed one coral into another coral by means of their bacteria, which of course is pretty good news because bacteria are much easier to manipulate or to engineer than any other entity. Which of course led to this idea. So now maybe you can do microbial therapy, which is written here. So use good bacteria, associate them with stress sensitive coral and makes them more resilient, which is actually what we did. There was one experiment where we used a group of good bacteria. We put it on coral and we run them through heat stress, and these corals became actually very tolerant. So to the point where we achieved a 40% increase in survival. So this is absolutely amazing. I really had year-long problems believing this, because in science you usually have very small effects that you are excited about. So having increased the number of surviving corals by almost half, this is pretty impressive. So, and again, coral reef biology and the medical science field is actually not that different, right? So they have an approach which is called microbial transfer therapy. So people that undergo antibiotic treatments as a consequence of, for example, organ transplants, you can imagine that you basically have to bleed the entire, you have to curb the immune system of these people. And what usually comes with that is also an antibiotic therapy. So these people have a completely destroyed microbiome. And it's very hard sometimes for these people to rebuild the good bacteria. So one thing that was actually shown to work well is to isolate bacteria from healthy individuals as donors and to give it to the susceptible individuals. And then you can reconstitute the microbiome. So this is pretty much what we are doing here. And like in humans, it actually works amazingly well on average. But there's two things that are not addressed with this. A, we actually don't know what the characters of these bacteria are. What are you looking for in a bacteria that makes it a good bacteria? And B, of course, whatever you put on there, you want it to stay on there. So this is the two kind of things that you have to address, the two bottlenecks, and this is actually very well acknowledged. So believe it or not, or I don't know if you know it, so this microbiome engineering is actually very broadly used in the agricultural world, which you can imagine, right? Crops, they need to grow well, and you usually supplement them with bacteria to make them grow better and so on, and they all have this, or there's a lot of studies that acknowledge this so-called boom and bust. So you give this good bacteria, you have a good effect initially, and then the effect wears off. What is the problem if it wears off? You have to reapply it. What is the problem with reapplying? Well, in the coral world, you have to go diving, and then you have to put it on every coral. And I can tell you, I think there's an average of 10 million coral in one reef, if it's a good reef. So it's impossible, pretty much. If you would take all the coral reef biologists in this world that dive, even for one reef, you couldn't achieve it, probably. So you need to find another way, which is where Professor Highway Lu comes into play. So basically the way you do it is you look for these traits in our language that you assume have a beneficial effect, but you don't really know if they have an effect. But what Highway did, he inverted the search pattern. So the other side is evolutionary. If a bacteria commits to a host, there's very clear genomic signatures which you can find, and you probably all heard that sequencing became very cheap. right? It's funny, so 20 years ago, the human genome was sequenced, and I think, I forgot it was a lot of money. So we are now really in the age where I could basically swap my saliva, I could extract DNA, and I could sequence my entire genome for 100 Hong Kong dollar or US dollar? 100 Hong Kong dollar, very cheap. Okay, well, you still need somebody to analyze it, which is much more expensive, but the data you could generate for 100 Hong Kong dollar. So this is not the bottleneck is not the sequencing anymore. So this is just how we look at stuff. But there's basically a lot of bacterial isolates that you can compare, and then you find some of these isolates that have this signature of undergoing host commitment. One is called MC10B4, and this is a great example how science doesn't come up with names that are very accessible to the public, right? MC10B4 is very boring and unexciting if you put this in a news headline, but it's actually how we talk to it, so we have to come up with a better name at one point. But so this bacteria, it basically, there's a lot of things on this slide. I know I'm trying. So we put it on corals in the field, and this is the Hong Kong summers before, and this is the Hong Kong summer 2 years ago. So this is off the charts water temperature. Okay, this is what we just talked about. But in this summer, and we don't know how the next summer looks like, this is when this experiment was done. So you applied this good bacteria to the corals in the field, and these corals actually did better in a natural reef, in a natural environment, in a natural heat stress. So this is as close as you get to this proof of principle. And they also stayed associated over this entire time. So they had a beneficial effect, and they were still present after 8 months. So really, I'm very excited about this. You are very excited about this. Because now you have something that is, you can actually scale, and you address these two things, right? Like the long-term association and host benefit. So we received funding for this international collaboration to actually do this in a field site in Indonesia, which is important for several reasons. You could do it here, but doing it there actually also proves the point that you can do this anywhere in the world, right? Because this is not arguably a super high-tech field site, right? But I'm pretty confident we will make this work. But this is actually, we are building a field lab now. This is a 3D rendering, and tomorrow I'm flying there, and then we can compare how it looks in reality. So this is where we do this. Gili Asahan is a very small island. This is this local community that we work with. But the point is that sometimes I feel like Homer Simpson. There is this retirement home in The Simpsons, and they have this sign on the door, "Thank you for not discussing the outside world." Right, so I'm now in the opposite. I'm discussing the outside world with you because it's important, because as a scientist in coral reef biology, it's not good enough to do the biology. You actually have to go out and talk to people and try to make a difference, which we are trying to make here. And also because it's now this case that I literally, I'm long enough in the coral business to actually see how bad things become over a relatively short time frame. Okay, and with that, I want to finish. So the bottom line, basically, the situation is dire, but we can and we have to do something about it, and we can and we have to do it now. And I actually, in my week here, I will definitely be back, but there's also a lot of willingness to collaborate, and there's a lot of understanding that we have to tackle these challenges together. And I think this is really, we are all world citizens, right? This is how we have to move and think about these things. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.